Hey, peace and salutations, beautiful people. Welcome to The Paper Plane. The Paper Plane is a podcast created and hosted by myself, Colin Masashi Rohahio Ehara, where I interview people I am blessed and honored to share community with, asking them about a book or books that have had a transformative impact on their lives. And in a society where literacy rates are steadily declining, our attention spans and critical consciousness are under attack, and a growing number of podcasts hosted by cishet men consciously or unconsciously champion expressions of masculinity that come at the expense of women, femmes, and LGBTQIA two-spirit, plus especially BIPOC folks. This space imperfectly aims to operate as a counter-narrative to those things. The Paper Plane is a space that intends to highlight the dire importance of relationships, community, dialogue, perpetual learning, honest expression as art, art as honest expression, freedom for literacy, and of course, literacy for freedom. It speaks to planes of existence attached to the act of reading, but also as a metaphor for the flights we take as we sit in what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a one-way interface as readers and how these journeys shape us. Today's guest is a former student of mine, a former mentee of mine, a current colleague, a fellow Richmond, California raised May Gemini, who is the BDay twin of my firstborn child, Aya, someone I consider family and whom I lovingly refer to as my young mentor. Though I am an elderly millennial and she an elder Gen Zer, I would argue that in the last decade, we, in different and similar ways, grew up together in our careers as educators. Janet Muro Vera is a San Francisco-born, Richmond-raised Chicana. As the first in her family to pursue higher education, Janet earned her bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in health education from San Francisco State University. During her time at San Francisco State, she studied abroad at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Melbourne, Australia, where she advanced her studies in adolescent and developmental psychology. After returning home, she worked as an after-school educator at her former high school, where she discovered a love for education and decided to pursue a career in teaching. Coincidentally, her teacher residency program paired her with her former English teacher, Mr. Ehara, yay, who became her lifelong mentor and chosen family. Oh, bruh. Shortly after, she earned a master's in education from the University of the Pacific. Since then, she has served in various roles, including English, English language development teacher, lead teacher, interim dean of students, advisor, and her personal favorite, psychology teacher. Janet created and implemented her school's first A through G approved psychology course, combining her two greatest passions, education and psychology. During her summer, she teaches middle school psychology through Summer Springboard at UC Berkeley. Janet is a proud Zacatecana, the daughter of immigrant parents and the sister of three brothers, whom she affectionately calls both her greatest challenges and her biggest blessings. A fun fact about her, she had the unique experience of being her younger brother Sergio's high school teacher, a role she considers one of the most memorable and rewarding moments of her life. Outside the classroom, you'll often find her browsing the Google Flights Explore tab, planning her next adventure. She has a deep passion for travel, learning through experiences, and connecting with new people. And with that, I am so happy to welcome Janet Muro Vera to the Paper Plane. Janet, welcome. How are you doing, family?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm doing well. Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Very happy to be connecting with you and talking to you about this very important book, this bridge called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, edited by Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzaldua. And I will turn it over to you to break down the synopsis.
All right, sounds good. All right, This Bitch Paul My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, is a feminist anthology edited by Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzaldua, first published in 1981 by Persephone Press. The book centers on the experiences of women of color and emphasizes the points of what is now called intersectionality within their multiple identities, challenging white feminists who made claims to solidarity based on sisterhood. Writings in the anthology, along with the works by other prominent feminists of color, call for greater prominence within feminists for race-related subjectivities and ultimately laid the foundation for third wave feminism. It is among the most cited books in feminist theory.
Beautiful. Let's go. So please note wonderful folks tuning in, that the spoilers will abound in this episode. And also, with regards to a content warning, we'll be discussing the following themes as it pertains to this particular work. We'll be talking about intersectionality and identity, the power of storytelling, feminism and BIPOC women's liberation, the role of anger and indignation in social change, language as resistance, solidarity and conflict within marginalized communities, and education as a site of liberation. And so, Janet, as we kind of open things up here, I am curious to ask you what made you choose this powerful anthology, edited by the Indigenous and Chicana scholars Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzaldua, for us to discuss today on the paper plane, and what quote unquote journeys would you say that this text has taken you on?
I chose this book because I wanted to choose a book that I felt like stood out to me at different points of my life and a book that made me feel connected in very important moments of my life. So when choosing a book, I tried to think of the person that I was both like in high school, college, and now in my educational journey. And I wanted to find something that connected in different ways with all of those experiences.
Mm,
So I thought about Gloria Anzaldua is the author that came to mind. I had thought about Borderlands, but then I came with this one because I think it does an amazing job of highlighting the experiences of multiple women of color. And I think the first time that I read this book, I felt empowered. Um, and I think empowered for different reasons. And I think it was the first time that I had read something where I I began to reflect along on the different intersections of my identity.
mm, mhm,
So like what it meant to like be a woman from immigrant parents, be American, Mexican, Chicana, a sister, a friend, a learner, primarily like a learner. And I think this book really pushed me to be unapologetic about all of these facets of my identity. And I think like ultimately like it helped me encounter my own voice and expression through writing. Like I always loved writing, but I think after reading this book, I I felt as if it pushed me to it pushed me to like share my voice, not just with myself, but with others. Like
mm,
just I
mhm.
felt more willing to write and to share what I felt and to like appreciate writing as a vulnerable thing.
Yep.
And I think writing is a vulnerable thing, so I think this book does a great job of pushing readers to do that and to both see words, text, and like the print as like a liberating experience. So
Mm,
I think that there are many things in this book that I could talk about, but I feel like if there's something that encompasses that, it's just the voice that I feel like it gave me. So. Yeah, we'll
mm.
talk more about it later in the details of it, but
Yeah.
I think mainly when I'm thinking of voice and identity. Mhm.
Really beautifully said. Thank you so much. And that's a perfect segue into this first question I have for you around intersectionality and identity. As you were noting, this bridge called My Back amplifies the voices of women of color and explores how race, gender, sexuality, and class and other facets of identity intersect. Wondering in your mind, how can educators help students understand and explore intersectionality in a way that is both personal and academically, quote unquote, rigorous? And I know this is something that we have explored together years ago, and
Mhm.
you have done, ever since then.
I guess before I start answering the question of how educators can help students, I do want to first talk about the identity part and reflect it with my own experience because
Mm.
I do feel like that grounds the conversation of my responses for how I'm bringing
Absolutely,
it into the classroom.
for sure.
So I think with this book, and it does so in like really powerful ways, I think it really helps give language to experiences.
Mm,
For myself specifically, I'm thinking that it helped me understand what it meant to be Mexican, what it meant to be American, what it meant to be a woman in different spaces. And I think that it helped me do some internal like identity work within myself. And I think that once I was able to solidify that and to be comfortable voicing my reflections and my realizations, I think that that made me a better teacher and better
Mm,
equipped to teach this book.
mm,
So I guess when I'm thinking of why I continue to teach it in education, I think it's because like I acknowledge the power that it had in me, and by being open and sharing that with my students and honest about my reflections, I think that they see that, and I hope that it pushes them to do the same and
mm,
to see it as like a text to then both continue like the dialogue and the value of that. So I guess to answer your question, sorry, I just feel I have to state that because
no,
it
no,
does
no, that's
like,
great.
yeah, yeah. To answer your question, how can educators help students understand and explore intersectionality in both personal and in a way that's personal and academically rigorous? When I'm thinking of the academically rigorous part, no, sorry, the personal rigorous part, that's kind of what I was trying to allude to in the beginning. I think that it gives like starting off with the text, like it helps students make sense of their own identities first.
Hmm.
And I think that that's something that's really, really hard to do
Yeah.
without having a strong text. Because I think like what I'm thinking that I do a lot is I have students identify quotes that resonate with them, experiences that they share or that they don't share. And like having them first identify similarities and differences within their own experiences. Um, that is like the first part of starting conversations.
Mm,
And I'm thinking how I teach it alongside with Kimberly Crenshaw's framework of intersectionality. And I guess like how I brought it in my classwork, and I feel that I've gotten more powerful over the years, is that we start off by teaching this book alongside other authors of color as well. Just to also like point out how there's not just one experience, that there's multiple experiences,
mm,
but also really pushing students to identify the quotes that resonate with them.
yep.
I think like once we have quotes first, then the way that I teach it in my class, I prepare for a fishbowl discussion like after the quotes. So like I give them like essential questions. Then
Mm,
we talk about like both with Gloria and Anzaldua, Cherie Moraga, and the other authors in this text, their perceptions and understandings of the book. And then we make connections with our own experiences.
mm,
And I guess how to keep academically rigorous as well is that I make connections to well to standards, grade level standards, and like we first start off with conversation with each other, and then I give space for them to write that down, and we turn it into like a further reflection piece in a more independent setting.
mm,
Um, so I think that's something that has really helped is creating like handouts that like support with the preparation for the writing,
yeah.
because I think the preparation for the writing is extremely important when analyzing a book like this, which is really complex. Something that I like to do is I like to preview the text and whatever text or passage that I want to point out and highlight vocabulary that I predict might need further deciphering and unpacking.
Mm,
And we do that first, and then I feel like that has helped the overall comprehension of the text
yep.
because through like stronger comprehension, that equates with like deeper analysis as well.
Yeah.
So. So I think how we can like now how educators can prepare to teach a book like this, um, I think really doing that analysis like internally first.
Yeah.
I
100%.
think it I think it's important for like for an educator to connect with the text first in a deep way, and see kind of where their stances are, what they're willing to unpack for themselves, but also like the questions that they have, because I think it's like another level when like us as educators, we also show our students that we also have questions, that
Mm,
um, we also might not agree with certain things or that we will. So I think that modeling that for students like has really helped students engage with text as well.
mm. So many powerful points that you bring up here, and I deeply appreciate. I think where you start around, modeling vulnerability as strength. And also, it's making me think about, actually, in my last interview for this pod, my homie Lisa, who's a professor of English at DVC, talking about like how much it matters that, you as the educator care about the text that you are teaching, right?
Hmm.
And how that can tie to, things like academic freedom of like why it's so important for teachers to be able to, choose what we teach. Um,
Hmm.
and and also you reminded me of one of my mentors, Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade, who talked about essentially like a lot of these kind of conscious or unconscious kind of conflating academic rigor, quote unquote, with like students like suffering, right? Or like, and in actuality, and like, kind of what he says, and this isn't verbatim, but he says is like if you are unable or unwilling as an educator to, help, young people connect to a text, then it's not what you're doing is not academically rigorous, right? Like, and I
Hmm.
think, you spoke, powerfully to the ways that all these different behind the scenes kind of steps, right, that you take, to help scaffold things, to like help folks, kind of be able to have access to the text and like what parts do you connect to, right? And you
Hmm.
also named at the end like, I love this text, but maybe there's some parts that I wrestle with or I don't fully agree with too. And like modeling, reading something closely, reading something critically. And and you're being a storyteller in this moment about like unpacking some of that. I want to move into kind of these pieces around the power of storytelling. And so, personal narratives, poetry play a central role in this anthology. And I know that you're an English teacher, but you also teach psychology, and that's like, a big part of your love for teaching. From like a psychology educator perspective, how does storytelling or how can storytelling help individuals process trauma, reclaim agency in your experience? How can teachers incorporate storytelling in their classrooms to foster empathy and resilience?
Great questions. When I think of storytelling, the first thing that comes to mind is that storytelling is most powerful when it's authentic, and one can't have authentic conversations with someone else unless there's trust and like the feeling of safety.
Hmm.
So, um, I think that in order to prepare, like from first, I'm going to speak on the educational standpoint, and then I'll go a little bit into the connections that I feel like exist like within psychology. And there's kind of more where that I want to share about that later on in the podcast. But I think that a very important thing, well, relationships, building relationships specifically, it is the prerequisite to having authentic and powerful conversations. Like if those relationships with your students are not built, it's almost impossible to have an authentic dialogue,
Yeah.
especially around a book like this that highlights both like a lot of struggles, a lot of like identity work and inauthentic conversations. Like I push my students to just be honest. Like if there's something that they don't understand or something that they're willing to unpack, even if it feels uncomfortable, I always tell them like through storytelling, dialogue, and conversation, like that's how we're going to learn. So I think that when we start talking about a book and how specifically storytelling helps process trauma, I think that one of the first things that I tell them is to really ask the people that they care about, the people that came before them to share their stories.
Mm,
And that's something that I say is, I acknowledge that that's a privilege that I have my parents that have shared stories with me, my grandparents. I've talked and shared stories with them, and I've showed my students that through those stories, you learn not just about them, but about yourself and about the world. So I start off by sharing with my stories, just I guess the power that storytelling has had on me.
mhm,
But I share that with them, but I also encourage them to Like, it doesn't just have to be like a blood family member. There are many of us that are not close to our blood family members. It can be anyone that one feels connected to or even curious about, or even like the slightest little thing that you might learn about a person.
Mm,
And that you never know like how that might spark a conversation. And then that conversation might spark like this whole maybe a realization or a very huge learning moment that might make you learn something about yourself as well.
mhm,
So I think of just how the conversations that I've had, like I think of my grandma, Ramoncita, who en paz descanse, we love and I miss her dearly,
mhm,
about how just her experiences and my mom's were incredibly different.
mm,
And then I reflect on how even mine, it's extremely different from both of theirs. But even though our three experiences are extremely distinct, it's through storytelling that like we are bonded by love and we identified similarities and differences. And I think the honesty and the authenticity of our conversations has helped me understand the person that I am.
mm,
And and I feel like understanding who I am and understanding the specific experiences that maybe the traumatic experiences that my grandma went through, that my mom went through, and it's just like this lineage, like it continues both the positive and the struggles, right? So
mhm,
um I think like learning that and understanding that it helps you process your old life and your experiences. And once you're willing to process, I feel like it's easier to heal.
mm,
Because unless you talk about it, and that's something if you ask anyone that I tell, I'm someone that really struggles with opening up a lot to people that I don't trust.
mhm,
So I've gotten better at this, but
mm,
I think that we need to be willing, and when I say we, I mean myself, the people that I care about, the people listening to this podcast, all of us, we need to be willing to, even if we feel shy, even if we feel not as confident or if we feel like a story doesn't matter, like it does.
mm,
Because it's going to matter to someone and it's going to impact someone in ways that you won't even imagine until you have that conversation and you're willing to engage in that storytelling.
mm,
So I guess when when I'm thinking of like how storytelling could come up in classrooms and how as educators we could push storytelling, is just equally as pushing storytelling, pushing honesty.
mm,
And just the realness. I can't emphasize the authenticity part enough because storytelling, it's not going to be worth much if we are like putting up a front or putting or not being like
mm,
honest with the reality of the experiences because then it's no
yeah,
longer storytelling, it's story creating in the moment, you know?
yeah,
So I feel like just honesty conversation, it pushes learning, it pushes listening, authentic listening.
yeah,
And ultimately, we might feel empowered by someone else's stories. We might feel similarities with struggles that we've had. And at times when maybe things were hard, like we might not feel alone. And that's that other maybe boost that we needed to continue to keep
mm,
going.
mm.
So, yeah,
That's
I think of all those things. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing. That's it's really, I don't know, it was like such a beautiful kind of vision I was having of like you like, you know, sitting and talking story with, your grandmother as when you were younger and like learning from mom and haven't I've gotten to meet your mom maybe once or twice really briefly. I never got to meet your grandmother, but I know, in no uncertain terms, right? Just like how amazing they are because of knowing you. Right. And so when I think about, these legacies and these lineages that, things get passed down, um, I think a couple of things that you were speaking to really popped out at me as far as, um, I think you are somebody who has a lot of courage with regards to processing and telling stories. And it hasn't been my experience really ever seeing you struggle to, be vulnerable. But I'm thinking specifically in the context of like working with young people, right? Because I
Mhm.
imagine, when you're talking about, some of like overcoming that challenge, that it was probably with peers and
Mhm.
folks that like, on like older adults. But I think. um, so much of
Oh, can
what.
I?
Oh, go
Sorry, I
ahead.
don't mean to
Yeah, yeah,
cut.
go
I don't
ahead.
mean to cut
No,
you
it's
off, but I
okay.
had a thought,
Yeah,
and
please.
I kind of want to speak more on that part that you noticed because now that you're saying that out loud, I actually hadn't realized that, like how like you've observed me teach multiple times, and you observed myself interact with students, and you're right. Like I just had a realization right now that I am more vulnerable with my students than I am with people like my age or in other settings, and I think that that goes back to why I'm in education in the first place. It's
Hmm.
because I want to show others, like students younger than me, I want to show the generations that come after me.
Mm.
Like when I learn something, it's my like I get excited, I get joyous, I want to pass that on.
Yeah.
And if I learned something that made my life better, I want to show that to my students. And I feel like that overpowers the maybe like the nervousness that I have, like
Mm. Yep.
that willingness to make the world better and to make someone feel better. And like if I like
Mm.
that, that's stronger than maybe the fear that I had to speak up. So maybe
Mm.
um, that's why I really push storytelling. I even think of my when you were saying that, I thought about my advisory. A group
Mm.
of young women that I was with for 4 years and how much they taught me as well.
Yeah.
I always told you that I have three bros. I love them. They're my best friends, but I always wish that I had sisters.
Mm.
And that's something, well, obviously out of my control, but
Mm.
um but I think that with my students and with my like advisory specifically, like they also helped me a lot in unpacking and processing trauma and processing emotions and processing that through storytelling because they would ask me questions and then I would ask them questions. And I think together we got really comfortable processing together.
Mhm.
So I think that storytelling, both with young people and just with peers, like I've learned that it doesn't happen just in a classroom. It's conversations that happen outside of the classroom. It's conversations that the natural conversations that just come up. So you're right. I do process. I am more vulnerable with younger generations, and it is easier because I even think that sometimes younger generations there, I'm I'm really hopeful and powerful that I don't know. I get emotional thinking of like
Mm.
I'm really proud of my students and I'm really proud of my kids and I'm hopeful that they will make the world better and I continue to be hopeful through
Mm.
this. Yeah.
Well, I would argue that, there's not much more revolutionary than like unapologetically, caring about people and specifically young people, and I think that, in some of the vein of like thinking about your advisory, right, and having all these younger sisters in that space, right? I want to jump to this next piece around feminism and BIPOC, specifically women's liberation, because in this text, right, which is just barely but older than me, but still, incredibly relevant to
Hmm.
kind of what's happening today, right? So the book critiques mainstream feminism, right? White middle class feminism for often sidelining women of color, sidelining women who are raised working class or poor, sidelining women of color who are disabled, right? All these different intersectional pieces, that pertain to, different forms of oppression. And so I'm wondering how can we create more inclusive discussions about feminism in education that acknowledge and address these historical exclusions? And also maybe one thing to add to that too is maybe what have been some of the challenges that you've ever run into teaching some of this to boys and young men of color, if any at times.
The critiques themselves are the problem. Like
Mhm.
this book talks about like writing, pushing the expression of voice like in the most raw like form, right? So I think that a lot of the times what I have heard happen and seen happen, specifically with like authors like this is like some people I feel like they get intimidated because it's too real.
Hmm.
It's too real and too straight up, or it's not this, it's not that. But I think what we should be focusing on are why are you saying that it's not this and that it's not that? Like, why aren't you accepting it for what it is in its purest, rawest form? Because that's how it was intended to be written.
Mm.
Do you get what I'm saying? So it's like
Yeah.
I think of that. I think that as women, we're allowed to uplift the rights of women and that not be at the ex like that doesn't mean that it's at the expense of like the dehumanization or continued like degrading of others. Like it doesn't mean that
Yeah.
those two things are not in isolation, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's this writing can exist and should exist for what it is.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that it's like I feel like the filling in the gaps, that's what others are doing. But I
Mm.
think in that moment, what these authors would say, it's like, okay, then write about it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you get what I'm saying? So
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's more so my response about this and how we can create inclusive discussions is pushing that writing, right? So
Mm.
just like they have this perspective, I have my perspective. We each have our own perspective of this text. I think there is gaps, right? There is gaps, but maybe they didn't feel like they could write authentically about those gaps because that was not their experience.
Mm.
And I think with these two and multiple authors actually, what they would say, it's like they would encourage the authentic writing. They would encourage others that can't speak authentically about their experience to do so to fill those gaps. And I think that what they also highlight and acknowledge is that we need more of that, right?
Mm.
Because when I'm thinking of um, being a sellout, right? We
Mm.
can have a whole other conversation about this too, right? Sometimes we censor authentic writing because of potential readers,
Mm.
because of maybe monetary income that,
Yep.
maybe it's going to get critiqued. So, and I think that in those moments, I think the value and the power of this book is that it it's a spot for like it's a spot to push writing for other people that can't speak on experiences to do so.
Mm.
And I think sharing that to students and pushing them, giving them like the tools, like just how these two, like these artists and these books and many other books I read about where people share their experiences, they're modeling their experiences too because that's the
Yeah.
experiences that they know. That is theirs, that is authentically theirs, and they're entitled to that. They don't have to give explanations for that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think just in those same ways, just teach students that they also have those tools. They also have that voice, and they
Mm.
should use that voice to continue sharing their experiences as well.
Yeah. And I think, some of what you're making me think about is, what they write about too, really extensively, right, is breaking away from these internalized recordings, patterns around, I think specifically, women of color, from very, very young ages being socialized to be caretakers, right? And if you're going to have the authentic expression that you're talking about, like you're going to, make some people uncomfortable. And that could go against this gravitational pull of like, I'm supposed to take care of and make people feel comfortable around me,
Mm-hmm.
right? And just like the courage that it takes to break out of some of those patterns, and even to even, the first step of even identifying them,
Mm-hmm.
along the lines of being targeted by sexism. I have no idea
Mm-hmm.
like what that's like, right? And so I'm I think it's really, really incredible that, and I'm thinking maybe specifically about, your advisory and your younger siblings in there, but all of your students, getting to have a teacher who's putting these things in front of them. And I think this leads into kind of this next piece, and maybe I'm curious kind of what experiences you've had maybe in like whether it's with your advisory or some of your young women students, female-bodied students, around this piece of like the role in anger and social change, right? And maybe specifically the anger that exists with the intersection of experiencing both racism and sexism as women of color. Right. So, many of the essays in the book express this justified, indignation, anger against systemic oppression. In both literature and psychology, anger is often seen as quote unquote destructive, yet it can also be this huge catalyst for changing unjust systems. And so I'm wondering, how do you believe that educators can or should approach anger, indignation as a topic in both literature and also mental health discussions?
Great question, and I appreciate that you asked about the intersections of mental health discussions and topics like these, like topics about systemic oppression, sexism, and racism, ableism, all that, because they're connected.
Hmm.
And I think what we don't talk about enough is how they're connected.
Mm,
Um, I think that what comes to mind first, anger, just like any other emotion, is valid.
mhm.
It's valid. It's natural. Everyone experiences anger, and anger looks different in every person.
Yeah.
So I think as educators, I think the first step to even have a conversation about these two topics, about both like anger and oppression, how anger is perceived by others, by how we express and when we express anger, I think the first thing is to validate students and validate all students that anger is natural. It is a human response. It's a human physiological response to a feeling.
Hmm.
And I think once we establish that, I think that we need to push students to understand and recognize what anger feels like to them
Hmm. Hmm.
in their bodies and how they react when they feel angry. Because an
Hmm.
anger reaction is different, similar like to stress, right? An anger reaction is different than an anger feeling, like a feeling of anger, sorry.
Hmm.
So just for myself, for example, like how I when and how I feel angry, I don't it's internal. It's more internal. It depends. It depends when, but most of the time it's internal and it only becomes external in certain situations.
Hmm.
And I think that the first thing that we need to do as educators is give students the space and opportunity to engage in that reflection first, because understanding what anger looks like for us, it's going to help humanize the conversations around anger.
Hmm.
And once something is humanized, any topic, in this case, the feeling of anger, once that I feel like it's recognized that it is a universal experience that we all have and we feel. I think once we establish that it's a universal experience, it's easier as an educator to have conversations about why the reactions to anger are different for women versus to men.
Hmm.
Like, I think that also growing up with brothers, male identified male brothers, cousins, and growing up having to, because I would, it's not because of how they would react to me, but I felt like I just needed to hide when I was angry because I felt like they were going to make fun of me.
Hmm.
I thought, and my brothers are kind, but I feel like I don't know, it was something internal because my brothers have the most supportive human beings to be like in this world. Like they're, and it wasn't until we got older that even I feel like both of us, I mean, not both of us, but like all of us, my siblings and I, my brothers and
Yeah.
I think it wasn't until we got older that we began to talk about like our reactions when we were angry, specifically angry.
Hmm.
And anger is actually interesting that you bring this up because I guess when I was younger I wouldn't react when I was angry.
Hmm.
And as I got older, I was like, why am I not reacting? Let me just react and sh tell them how I'm feeling because that's when I got more comfortable to
Hmm.
share how I was feeling because I just felt confident in sharing that. I think like as I grew up and I matured. And I think after that, after being open to do that, I think I did help push my brothers, the men in my family, to understand that it was valid for me to feel these things. And I think that because they care about me, they didn't like to see me angry and they began also doing some like internal reflection on them. It's like, oh, why? did I saw them actively working towards like understanding if their actions were the cause of my like anger and what they did. I felt like they began more self-reflective. So um I think I kind of just went on a tangent here, but coming back to like why first thing, like it's important to just talk about how anger is real and that helps explain like the responses and the reactions that we see not just in our own families, but in society, in schools, even in peer like relationships,
Mm.
conversations.
Are there,
Um,
is it okay if I
yeah.
ask a follow-up
Yeah,
question?
yeah, yeah.
Are there, I don't know, are there particular ways that you like to or try to think about coaching, young women of color, students of yours, when they're experiencing, I would, especially like not just anger, but like justified anger at like, being mistreated or being disrespected or, or having their anger, like you were noting, like not being taken seriously.
Hmm. I think about what that reminds me of. So sorry, just to clarify your question, are you asking me if there's a specific way that I go about teaching anger and anger response?
Not necessarily,
Or
well,
no?
maybe, but I'm thinking like if you can think of, I don't know, any time, like any examples or times where, you've had, a student who is a young woman of color, who is experiencing feelings of rage, of anger, and like
Hmm.
how you've supported her in like working through or processing that particular emotion or those feelings.
I just thought about emotional like in my psychology class we learn about emotional regulation strategies and that's the
Mm.
first thing that came to mind. Um, and I think that well, the reflection part that I was talking about earlier is the first thing. So I won't disclose the student, but I'll disclose kind of like the experiences and the root of the anger.
Mm-hmm.
I think this student felt comfortable coming to me to share out the reasonings behind her anger, and she was very honest and vocal of like she was very well aware of the source of what it was, who it was. There was multiple things. She was so aware of it. However, at the end of like she wanted in the moment, what she needed from me was for me to listen, and I did.
Yeah.
But in the moment, as I was like listening to everything that she was sharing with me, internally, I felt very proud of how conscious she was of the root of her anger.
Mm-hmm.
So at the age of the student, she was a senior at the time. She was very, very aware of what were the things that led to her anger, and a lot of it, some part of it was herself too, and how she reacted.
Mm.
But I think when I proceeded, like after listening and to ask her, like, okay, now what are you going, like, what do you, before me just sharing what I think and my, I guess so, advice, I asked, like, now what are you going to do about this? Or what do you plan to do about this?
Mm.
And the response that I remember getting was like, I'm not going to do anything. It's not worth it.
Mm.
And then I think in that moment, when I hear that it's not worth it, that part reminds me of like my younger self and feeling that I couldn't express out what I felt because nothing was going to happen as a response to it.
Mm.
So I've started sharing that was the first thing that I did is that saying this isn't something that you're not the only one that has felt like this sense of what in Spanish the word we say is impotencia, like when you feel like anger and frustration, but you're not able to do anything about it.
Mm.
I
Mm-hmm.
can't yet find a word that means the same thing in English, but impotencia,
Mm.
it's like a feeling of anger and um yeah, like a feeling of anger, you can't do anything about it. So
Mm.
I think in that moment I did my best to share with the student that like she isn't alone and it's normal for her to feel this.
Yeah.
And I think that after that when I validated what she felt like and when I told her that it's normal, we then talked about how like there has been other people that have felt similarly. And then this is an opportunity where I pushed her to like lean into that discomfort, the discomfort of not feeling confident in sharing out and speaking because I was telling her like through communication, authentic communication, sharing of emotions and feelings, sometimes that's like the hardest thing, but that's the only way that you are going, that others will learn from you and you will learn from others.
Mm.
And then we go back to talk about how I guess I teach more about stress as opposed to anger, but it's when I'm thinking of anger, stress, you feel stress as well. So just identifying first the type of stress or the type of anger that one is feeling. Like, is it emotional? Is it physical in the body? Like, is it a result of a trauma? And though these are all words that we teach in that I teach explicitly in my class.
Yeah.
And I think that the like reminding students that they have these tools to process the emotions that they're feeling.
Yeah.
And then I think like giving students the language in this case that this student has been in my psychology class. Like, is it an emotional, like, is it something that's rooted, like, is it in something more emotional? Is it something that's more physical? Is it felt like as a product of like a specific trauma? And this student was really good at identifying, really, not really good, very
Mm-hmm.
aware of the root of it. But I don't think that in the moment of anger, I think she was just blinded by that feeling that she wasn't able to transition into
Yeah.
like a solution for herself. But I think reminding this student of these tools that they have, I think she was able to, okay, like come up with an action step of who was the first person. It came back to like a
Yeah.
person, like the person that she needed to be honest with what she felt.
Yeah.
So I guess to like loop back, loop back is just reminding giving students a space to share authentically like what they're feeling and not feel shame around that because I think sometimes there is a lot of shame that is felt when sharing feelings that are unpleasant, anger being one of them.
Mhm.
So I think just reminding the students that they are strong enough, they are capable to deal with it. And they're the ones that are going to be most equipped to do that. Like
Yeah.
I can only tell them so much. They're like, as long as they have like anyone can share with them, but unless they're willing to take that in and respond to it and act on it and in the way that feels authentic to them, like that's it's going to be hard to come out of it. So I think just reminding students that they're the ones that hold this power and hold this decision. I think that that has, I felt, I mean, I hope that it has, but I have helped that I have touched, like I've supported and helped students
Mhm.
lead to get to that their own realization because it's not mine. It's not mine to them. No, it's theirs. And I think it's more of supporting them and figuring that out for themselves because they're the experts of whatever they're feeling.
Yeah, no, that I really, really appreciate yeah, you're unpacking. There's a couple things that come to mind. So I think the first is that a lot of what we do, right, it has these titles, right, whether it's English, psychology, ethnic studies, right? But a lot of what we do is we do our best to teach communication, right? And not just like teaching, our students to, communicate effectively with others, right? But to begin with self and like being able to like be in dialogue and conversation with oneself to have a better understanding of like why do I feel the way I do? Why do I think the way that I do? Why do I see things the way I do? And also I appreciate the ways that you're naming kind of like, laying out these different tools for students to, kind of pick and choose and decide like which one is going to be most helpful to me in this moment. Um, and then the last piece that, this brought up for me was, returning to intersectionality and specifically around gender as it pertains to feelings, emotions, moods. Um, it was so interesting to, hear you kind of describe the very real pieces around shame that can happen when experiencing quote unquote negative emotions, right? Because I was thinking about something you really beautifully did was go back to your younger self and and it sounds like kind of whether you told her that story or not, look back and like pull out pieces of like what you were experiencing to support her, right, as a young person, as a young woman, in not falling victim in that moment to that shame.
Hmm.
And I say this because I recently had a really similar experience with a young man of color who, you know, we get socialized in many ways where like anger is the only thing that it's okay to show, right? And we don't get
Hmm.
shamed around that. We get shamed around grief, fear, those kinds of things, right? And so I was like, long story short, his like energy switched up on me because I couldn't help him right in the moment because I was in between things, and I was like, could you shoot me a message and then I'll answer the questions you have. And he was like really hurt because I couldn't help him in that moment, and almost like had this feeling of like I had betrayed him or something.
Hmm.
And I went, and I thought about it, I was like, what happened? And I got to think about it, and I was like, something I noticed is like a pattern in this young man was something that I thought about my younger self, as far as like I
Hmm.
carried a lot of anxiety, right? Still have struggles with anxiety today, but like if I couldn't kind of get the answers that I needed right in the moment, I was really impatient, and it made me, exude anger,
Hmm.
which regularly wasn't ever discouraged because I was raised a boy,
Hmm.
a young man in this society. And so I don't know. I think the reason I bring it up is because, I have and will continue to think about what are ways that, from our, specific kind of intersectional identities, can we, in these cases, like encourage, our young women, female-bodied students to express righteous anger that they carry,
Hmm.
and maybe with our boys, young men, male-bodied students, um, um, try to create space where it's okay to grieve, to show like fear, things like that, in thinking about those things. And in the vein of communication, right? And you were talking about, going back to storytelling a little bit, but Anzaldua in particular explores the idea that language can be a tool of both oppression and also liberation, right? Depending on who's telling the story, how they're telling it. And I'm
Hmm.
curious, and as a fellow Richmondite, right, like thinking about code switching, thinking about bilingualism, and so I'm wondering, like, how does code switching and or being multilingual, hybrid languages like Spanglish, for example, shape identity? How can educators validate and celebrate linguistic diversity in their classrooms?
So I'll address the first part. How does code switching and bilingualism shape identity? I think for all the folks out there that speak more than one language, any whatever language that is, like sign language included, I think that we are each like I think the first step in like teaching or attempting to teach this because it's hard. It's hard to teach. It's hard to support students in recognizing the value of multiple languages, especially like in the world that we live in, the world that we're growing up in. But I
Mm,
think the first step in doing that is just honoring and uplifting the value and the incredible personalities that come out of all of these languages. And that is okay. Like that is okay. Language isn't something that like language, whatever language that is, I think that it's important to remind students because they know they're proud of their language. At least my students, speaking for my students, and I know this wasn't always the case. This wasn't always the case. Like language wasn't always like seen as an asset to speak multiple languages. Um, I was born in a time that
mm,
that it was seen as an asset, and I am recognizing that um, prior to that, that always wasn't the case. But I think that it's important to share how we and uplift the different personalities that come with our multiple languages. What I mean by that is that, like, for example, I myself, like, and I share this with students, and I feel like this helps in teaching. Like, if you need support in teaching, like code switching and being multilingual, I think through example is an important part. Like if you yourself as an educator, if you're not multilingual, I think maybe find an author or a person that is and share their experience and analyze their experience. Because like through example, like I share how like Janet is a different person when she's speaking Spanish. Janet
mm,
is a different person when she is in the classroom here with you all teaching in English. Janet is a different person when she's with her friends. Like, so I think just sharing again, going back to storytelling, sharing that story and the importance of being able to code switch is very, very important. Because I think what I have seen and this is like when learning moments happen, is that I have seen students that are not the best at code switching. And unfortunately, like it wasn't like their intention to maybe say something a certain way, or maybe they got in trouble for saying something, that they shouldn't be saying. And a lot of that, and I've seen it happen, it's rooted in that they struggle with code switching.
Mhm.
And I think just teaching code switching and how it's not something that we don't need to do it to conform to someone else or to show up in a different space. Like the real reason behind that is that we can exist in different spaces in different ways, and that's okay. And
Mm,
sometimes, like to operate and navigate in these spaces, it's not that you're conforming to something else. No, it's more so you have, like, it's just something natural that you have to do.
yeah.
Like I can't show up to teach 100 something students and like I have to do so in a professional way. And for me, that's standard academic English. That's maybe not saying certain things that, but like I myself, I censoring certain things, maybe certain experiences. Like I it's important to share the stories of the people that are multilingual and how they code switch. And I think that gives like examples give experiences, and experiences give they help for understanding. Um and how can educators validate and celebrate linguistic diversity? Incorporating it into the classroom just by like asking. I like to ask my students like what languages and what identities are you bringing in? And something that I learned a lot last year specifically was asking students about their identities that I was both asking like coming from a place of curiosity, but
Mm,
like let that not be mistaken from like I'm not trying to say is like I think asking because you're genuinely curious and you care is one thing,
mhm.
but maybe a student is from a different identity than you. But what I'm not saying is ask them about everything, have them teach the class. Like, no, because that's just a whole other conversation. Let's not do that. But
Mhm.
what I'm trying to say, it's like finding a way to incorporate and educate yourself more too on their identities to support students in feeling seen and heard, but
Mhm.
also asking questions because through curiosity, like from my personal experience, students appreciate when I ask them questions about their identities when they're not similar to my own.
Mm,
So I think it's actually really hard because it's a fine balance of both.
yeah.
Because you have to be, it's okay to be curious, it's okay to ask questions, but it's also like you shouldn't put a student on the spot if they're different than you, because then that, like, you as the educator, you need to put in the work to be inclusive. You need to put in the work to learn more. I feel like
Mhm.
it's the educator's job, both as the adult, as a professional, and just as the human being to learn about things that they don't know of, that they're unfamiliar with. So I
Absolutely.
think I think it's actually like pretty like fine. It's like it's an interesting dance, so to say, but
Yeah.
because it's a dance, right? It's beautiful.
Yep.
We learn how to
Mhm.
math. It's actually, I didn't mean to go to that metaphor, but it's a dance. It's
Yeah.
it's actually a beautiful thing once you figure it out. And there's different ways of dancing.
Yeah.
And sometimes even when you're dancing, you mess up the rhythm. Like it's still fun and it's still like a learning moment, and there's still learning that comes out of that.
Mhm.
So just honesty, being honest about your own language acquisition journey too, for example,
Mhm.
um, all of the things, and sharing that, like it helps develop confidence. I think
Mhm.
that if there's something that speaking multiple languages helped me, especially in the development of my career, it's helped me be confident
Yeah.
in
Yep.
myself and how I show up.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. I mean, this subject means so much to me because, my graduate school research was around, not only kind of English supremacy within schools, and how it, um, reifies, supports white supremacy, but specifically formal standard academic English supremacy in US schools, and trying to think about, what are the ways that, you teach young people, equip them with the tools to communicate in formal standard academic English without
Hmm.
it coming at the expense of, any and all other forms of communication, right? And so I think about
Hmm.
like two people that I absolutely love because they um are just absolutely refuse to code switch are just popped in my head is kind of some of you were speaking are like Marshawn Lynch and Cardi B, right? Both incredibly successful, wealthy, right? And these kind of counter narratives to this idea that in order to be quote unquote successful, that particularly if you are black or brown and raised working class, that you have to, speak formal standard academic English. And so, I'm wondering, kind of what are the different ways that, you can have these discussions, we can have these discussions with students about the importance of like having the skill set to code switch, while also
Hmm.
noting there are like courageous folks out there that like have essentially refused the code switch and are still able to
Hmm.
be successful.
Hmm.
But just because of time, I'm going to begin kind of slowly getting towards closing. And you use this metaphor of like this dance, right? And this like almost like this balancing act, this tightrope walk. There's a lot of reason to feel distressed today. Um, as you know very well, and in thinking about our students, our families, our communities. The overt, forms of sexism, misogyny, violence against women, whether that's a verbal, physical, being kind of shouted down from the White House, and not just the White House. The forms of overt racism, of xenophobia, targeting, those perceived to be immigrant communities. Um, and a question I have is, in your experience, what have been kind of some ways that educators can balance, right, this need for, you know, having the courage to stare oppression, injustice in the face, while also trying to foster critical hope and empowerment with students?
Um, well, just to start off, I think my experience in as an educator, I think has been a very unique one that has shaped my ability to engage in this balance and this stance, right? Um, I've had the honor of like working with you and you have passed down all and very all of your curriculum and all of these like beautiful tools that I even remember learning like when I was a senior in high school. When I think of teaching, explicitly teaching the three eyes of oppression, internalized, interpersonal, institutional, I think like learning about that at a younger age in high school and having an educator like you at that time that really pushed us to make connections with the world around us and to do so confidently was like the first step in my growth towards analyzing how oppression lives and operates in multiple spaces. But I think that it wasn't until I continued my own learning, I learned that I had to be strategic with how I taught oppression and how I taught resistance.
Hmm.
And because resistance, like through resisting is like a liberating act, like well, if done in a transformational way. But like, what goes to mind, like comes to my mind, like as an educator, I think that the most important part is not just having and sitting with the conversations around oppression. I think that what oftentimes like I felt like maybe in the first couple of years of my career, I felt as if I felt very, very confident in how I taught oppression and how I had students like both identify it, recognize it, how it showed up in them and others in the world around them in different levels. But then like as I continued teaching oppression, I realized that it was most powerful when taught alongside resistance
Hmm.
and liberation. And I used to teach them separately. So I used to teach both of these concepts like oppression, liberation. I feel like I had to teach them explicitly. I had to explicitly teach the connection because I realized that just because I was teaching something and it was my assumption that when I taught oppression, like then in our conversation, it was my assumption that I was supporting students and pushing them to think about how can we move towards liberation? How can we move towards oppression? But it wasn't until like I began like just really having conversation with students, really diving into the work that they produce, that I realized that it wasn't for every student that this connection of oppression and liberation, like this connection wasn't happening. What I found was that many students were just sitting with identifying that they were very comfortable identifying oppressive systems, different acts of oppression, and in the different ways that it shows up.
Mm,
However, I found that there was like a missing component. I realized that for many students, it wasn't as clear of I wasn't as clear that we were learning this because our hope is that we're moving in the direction for for liberation, for resistance. So I had to readjust what I taught and how I taught it to make that connection more explicit. Because in my mind, it was. In
mm,
my mind, I saw, and I think that now as an educator, I recognize why that it was because I have had the, I want to say it is an honor. I had the honor to to be able to have these conversations confidently. Like I feel
mm,
comfortable having conversations about oppression,
yeah.
about like in all of its forms, right? But that's because of my schooling experience. That's
Mm,
because like I started learning this in high school. I continued learning this at SF State in San Francisco, you know? So
mhm,
I think that I was always empowered to have these conversations. And for me, it became a liberating act.
mm,
But as I continued and developed my journey in education, I realized that my experience was not the experience. Just because I was an alum of the same school that I'm teaching at, it doesn't mean that all of my students will have the same experience that I did.
yeah.
So I think that in order to push and move in the direction to help students feel empowered and hopeful is really making those connections explicit. How
Mm,
identifying oppression is the first step to identifying resistance and moving in the direction of resistance, and then identifying like how that looks like for ourselves. What can we do? What are the action items? And giving examples, both historical examples and current examples of what resistance looks like and how specifically it's transformational.
mhm,
Um, and I think that that's something that I do in my English class. But it's also something that I've tried to incorporate like in my even in my psych class as well. And I teach psychology in 11th grade. So I already start like there's certain things that we talk about and just the field of psychology and its history and how it is the field of psychology, there has been a lot of like there most of the psychologists that we study, almost all of them are white older males, right?
mhm,
Those are most of the theorists. So just being talking, having conversations about why is that? And now in the field, how can we move in a direction where, like, maybe we're analyzing from a different standpoint? Or how might this learning in the field of psychology be restrictive to the learning that we're, you know? So I feel like
mhm,
already incorporating that lens in other disciplines is very, very important
mm,
because this isn't something that just happens. This conversations don't just happen in ethnic studies classroom and different. No, and they need to happen because it's interdisciplinary. Like it comes up in the world that we live in, the world that we exist in all of shapes and forms, you know? So I think that as an educator, what we can do, regardless of the subject that you teach, it's not teaching it in a lesson and then just abandoning it like that. No, it's always adding that opportunity for students to identify like are there certain biases because those biases might be rooted in oppression.
mhm,
Are there let's look at the author, let's look at the theorists, let's look at this text, let's look at this quote. Right. So in all instances, really push students to engage in that critical thinking for themselves. But once that learning is identified, okay, now what can we do to move against this, to combat this, to move in the direction towards liberation? What does that look like for me? And what does that look like for those around me? So I
mhm,
think that it's something that, and you need to keep educating yourself as an educator. You need to keep adapting your curriculum. Like I think that's one of the biggest things because our world is changing.
Hmm.
Our world is always changing. Unfortunately, some things are repeating themselves. Like just making note of that. And I think that maybe the way you taught something 5 years ago and the way that you're teaching it now, you have also grown as an educator and you're more equipped with getting that lesson to the next level.
Hmm.
And I think like in your planning, just you trying out new things, like trying out what new maybe what new activity, what new conversation can I spark that might create this larger opportunity for learning for my students.
Hmm.
Or is there something that's happening right now in the world or something in the news, something we could decipher that connects and brings us back to this, right? Or I just think of like just continuing to also grow and educate yourself as an educator. I think that that will lead to the greatest opportunity to empower, to make your students feel empowered because it's communal learning. It's not
Hmm.
just like you're also learning, but to become a better teacher for your students. And I think that the moment that you're willing as an educator to engage in that work, I think that's when you become a better teacher for your students. Well, at least a
Hmm.
better teacher than the year prior, because we always got to keep learning. But
Absolutely.
but yeah, that learning and not just keeping the lesson on oppression and isolation. No, it's embedded, unfortunately. It's the world that we live in. So continuing to raise awareness of that in whatever space and capacity that we can, I think that that's going to lead to hopefully the growth of not just ourselves, but of our students and really pushing those critical thinking skills onto them.
Mm. Thank you for that wonderful breakdown of, like you said, the dance, right? That we engage in as we're trying to figure out all these things. And like your nods to this is a perpetual process. We're like never done learning, growing, becoming better as educators. And as we begin closing out here, thank you for all of the ways that you continue to bond with students, that you continue to build bridges while at the same time refusing for the bridge to ever be your back. And so as we close out, I'm going to ask you a couple questions that I ask all of my guests. And the first is, what is a song, a musical artist, or an album that you would pair with this book?
I would pair a musical group, Los Tigres del Norte.
Tell me
Los
about
Tigres,
that.
Los Tigres del Norte. I was actually really struggling with this question. I love music, but for
Yeah.
some reason,
You're a
I'm like,
musician.
where? Yes, I sometimes. So this one was really hard because I really wanted to find an artist that pushed the importance of embracing like our true selves and to feel confident in doing so and someone I try to find art authors I focus mainly on lyrics, right? So the people that came to mind, it's un grupo norteño called Los Tigres del Norte, and they do a lot of corridos. So corridos and the history of corridos, it's a lot of storytelling.
Mm,
So I wanted to find, I was like, yes, perfect. Tigres and Nortes. They do a lot of storytelling about like love and just, or lack thereof, or
mm,
struggles, life struggles, and also immigration. So they
mm,
talk a lot about immigration and existing in the United States and just immigrating, particularly from Mexico, and the struggle that comes with that. And
mm,
something that I really appreciate about corridos, like just that genre of music in itself, it's you're listening to a song and it's literally a story.
mm, mhm,
Like it's the story of a person or it's a story about like a time period. It's a story about a memory and experience. And I think similar to this book, there's stories.
mhm,
There's stories, their life experiences, their reflections. I just have a book here that I'm like looking at. But
mm.
yeah, Los Tigres del Norte for sure.
Love
No
that.
song in particular,
That's all good.
but
Yeah.
that group.
Especially with it being an anthology, that has multiple, like you said, stories. That's really great.
Mhm.
And then this last question before we do a special closeout, um, is if you could complete this sentence, please. People should read this bridge called My Back because dot dot dot.
People should read this book because it beautifully captures the physical and internal and complex struggles of not just women of color, but people of color as a whole.
Mm.
Um, Educators specifically should read this because it's a very strong text that can be like an anchor text, a core text to center conversations about racism, oppression, intersectionality.
Mhm.
Um, and I feel like if you're a struggling educator that you want to bring this, but you're not sure how, it's okay if you're not sure how, but the part is like the important part is that you try, and this book is a great book to begin those conversations.
Mhm.
And lastly, people should read this book because, like Cherie Moraga and Anzaldua said, the revolution begins at home. I
Mhm.
think this book does an amazing job of providing language for like Chicanas like myself. I think of people that are like me that we come from immigrant, lower working class, quote unquote traditional families. I say quote unquote because I know what that means, but I don't even know what it means. So like I just know what it feels like. Like what does that mean? What does traditional mean? Traditional what? But whatever. That's
Mm.
another conversation. But I think it gives people like us, if you are someone with a similar background and experience like me, it gives starters for conversations that we can have with our families. I think
Mm.
that like sharing some of this with like my parents, my brothers, and it also provides guidance and advice because
Mhm.
it's people that, although they're not, you don't have the same, we weren't alive in the same time periods, we don't exist in the same time periods. I feel like it's so real because the struggles are still the same, but in
Mm.
different ways.
Yeah.
And I think it does a great job of highlighting that.
Mm. So well said. Um, we want to, Janet and I want to actually dedicate, as we close things out, this episode to our beloved former student, Kelin KJ Sissoko, whose life was unfortunately, heartbreakingly taken a little over a month ago as a result of gun violence. And this week we will actually be attending his funeral service. And it was just recently that, I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that Janet and my daughter Aya have the same birthday, which is May 22nd. And I recently learned that KJ also has the same birthday of May 22nd, or had the birthday of May 22nd. And so we're going to close out by reading a poem. But before we do, I thought I would hand it over to both Aya and KJ's BDay twin, Janet, if there's any words you wanted to say about KJ.
AJ, it was an honor to share share this day with you, May 22nd. It was an honor to be your educator. It was an honor to learn from you. I'll forever remember you as a joyous, caring, funny, energetic human being. I'm a firm believer that I am a firm believer. I have faith that a higher above exists. And I know that you are there. And I know that as terrible as this feels like, there I'm a strong believer that there is a reason why you transitioned from this world to another one. And my heart feels sad, but hopeful that you left your mark on, I've seen it, but that you left your mark on the students, your peers, and the people around you. You definitely left your mark on me. So I, yeah, sorry. Colin, you can continue.
No, thank you so much, family. So to close, we're going to read the poem At Times Like This by the late great poet Nikki Giovanni, who originally wrote this poem and read it at the funeral service of Maya Angelou. We've changed the pronouns from she, her, hers to he, him, his, but the rest of this poem remains as it was originally intended by Nikki Giovanni, and we dedicate this to KJ, to KJ's family, and community as we mourn together.
At times like this, we measure our words because we are measuring a life.
Friend was not lost, nor did he transition. He died.
We recognize a good. Life was a lead, a generous heart ceased to beat, a hearty laugh will no longer be heard.
We measure not the depth, but the width of compassion and passion and dreams.
We place our love gently on the flowers that cover him, under the clouds that embrace him, into the earth that owns him and now reclaims him.
We will miss him, spirit his demands, his hopes for us, and therefore himself.
At times like this, we are sad, we gather, we comfort each other, yet still, at times like this, we properly cry.
KJ, we love you. We always will. Janet, thank you so much for being my guest today on The Paper Plane. Appreciate you, family. Much love.
It was an honor. Thank you for having me.
And to all those listening, wishing you a wonderful week ahead. And thank you for joining us on this flight. Peace.